go and crank the engine for me? No, just crank it. Turn it off and turn it back on. Okay. Oh, almost went. Go again. Okay. Okay, just a little crank, please. Okay. Crank it again. Just crank it. Again. 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 We have a 1976 911 Carrera, 2.7 liter. This car we haven't seen in 8 years. 8 years ago we did an engine for it. I haven't seen it since. Don't know if it's had any service or what's going on. When customer drove it in, complaint was hard start cold. Couldn't get it started when he drove it in. TAC is doing some weird stuff, like it's getting a weird signal. Was able to get it started this morning, and but only at wide open throttle would do 1,000 RPM. Going to look at fuel pressures first, then pull my distributor, I think, get it on the bench and see. It's got a Petronics igniter in it. They have given us problems over the years. To get it to start a little bit better, I put a newer coil in it and a newer generation CDI box, not just to slap it at it, but because of the way it was running and the way the TAC's acting. I wanted to eliminate any issues there. Looking at our fuel pressure. Yep, so our pressures are not that horrible. 4.5, 4.9, we're at 5.4. Control pressure right now is about 1.5 bar. And holding fairly steady. Does look like we have some leakage over here though on that fuel pressure regulator. So we need to see what's going on over there. So I just started the car. It had been starting and running fairly decently, and I had pulled the cap off and just looked at stuff and reorganized things. But when I just started the car, then it misfired, ran on 4 out of 6 and then 5 out of 6. So I took the cap and rotor off again and found this, where the wire, this is the signal wire for the Petronics, it's actually rubbing. Looks like it's been rubbing for quite a while on our magnetic block there, and I'm wondering if it has created enough of an interference to where it caused the car to get a weird signal to the CDI box. So I'm going to insulate that and secure this harness right out over here, start it up again and see what it does. Fingers. Nope, that was not it, because it misfired. I need to get a look in and see what's going on with that. My oscilloscope. So what I've done is I've hooked up my oscilloscope to my ignition trigger. So in this car, the easiest place to get it is where it sends the trigger to the tach on this 2-pole connector. This is the positive connection going to the CDI box. This is terminal 15. This black with a purple stripe is actually tied into the CDI trigger, so I can look at what my Pertronics is doing when I start the car. Well, that really wasn't a problem on the trigger side of things. I'll have to look at the coil side of things, but it seems to only do it when it's cold or cooler and hasn't run in a little bit. So I'm going to let it cool down and add a test probe onto my coil circuit and see what's going on there. So even though we couldn't catch it on film, I did see that when we were cranking, we were actually missing ignition pulses. And I kind of suspected that it was something to do ignition wise, because yesterday when I was cranking it, I had the tach doing one of these, bouncing it all over the place. So to remove the ignition distributor and put it on the test bench, what I'm going to do is put the engine on TDC number 1. Right now it's pretty close to TDC number 4. You can see the rotors pointing this direction, and number 1 marks right there. So I'm just going to turn the engine over. Right now we're coming up on our timing marks. Here's our 30 and 35 degrees before TDC mark. The red mark there is my TDC, and this is 5 degrees after TDC. So my ignition rotor is pointing right here at the notch in the ignition distributor, so I know I'm on cylinder 1. Crankshaft is on TDC, and all I got to do now is undo our 8mm nut, and I should be able to go ahead and pull out our ignition distributor and put it on the test bench. Okay, and then I'm going to unplug my Pertronics. Just to be on the safe side, sticking a shop towel over the hole, make sure nothing drops in. So to make our Pertronics unit work, we need to power it up, and on my test bed I have a DC power generator, so I'm just giving it a 12-volt signal. I'm grounded to my distributor machine, because without it, it won't work, since the Pertronics needs ignition power. And then we're going to go ahead and hook on. This is my oscilloscope probe, because I want to see what it's doing. All right, so we're all hooked up. Power on with our machine. Cranking speed. We got a pretty clean So what I saw on the car was dropping ignition signals out, is what I saw on the vehicle. But I only saw it for the very, very first crank that we weren't filming. We stopped, went to crank again, and the car started and ran. So one of the other things you'll see on the Pertronics is a couple of things, and I'll zoom in a minute. One, we can see it's got this really high tail right here, which is indicative of points when they have a lot of load, but there should be no load. This should give a really nice, clean, square wave. Then the other thing that you're going to see if I zoom in, right now we're on 1 volt division. Here's my 0 volt line. Now a good set of points will make it all the way down to ground. And you can see the ground, because Pertronics is giving an artificial signal to the CDI box, you'll see it never makes it all the way to ground. So that signal is only getting down right around 1 volt. doesn't usually cause a problem. Usually the biggest failures that I see on Pertronics unit is as they get hot, this gets higher and higher and higher, and we'll get to the point where it doesn't have enough of a signal to fire the CDI box. Also, you can see the waveform looks a little crappy right here, even when it's coming back down to that ground signal. It's actually coming at 1.5 volts or 1.25 volts, and then slowly creeping down under that 1 volt line. So just after running for a little while, and we're only running at about 350 distributor RPM or 700 engine RPM, see our top signal starting to float. So I'm going to see if I can push this into a failure mode. .2 volts. Well, no, that's the trigger where it's erratic. See, when I go up to 2.5 volts, now see how it stabilized the waveform? So that means the trigger is only getting within 2 volts of ground. Because this is my level to trigger the waveform. If I bring it under the voltage, so see at 2.2, see how the voltage is just walking across the screen?
Yeah.
That's because it can't read anything below that voltage level. So 3 volts, we've got a nice clean trigger. We can put it back in the car. Put the oscilloscope back on it, measure power and ground at the same time. Power and trigger. See what happens. But if the car starts, then we won't know anything. So one of the other things that could be happening is the Pertronics may be losing power when the engine is cranking. So I'm always starting at the battery. And first thing I find is a battery that doesn't really fit. It's too small. Next thing I find is negative battery terminal is loose. It's also kind of been scabbed in there with multiple parts. When I pull it up, half the connection is corroded. So really not helping things. I can see the positive is a little better, but it's also corroded in there. So I'd really like to confirm the problem. I think what I should do is leave the distributor in the distributor machine and let the electronics cool off. Try it a couple more times on startup and see if it gives me the same problem. If it doesn't, I'll put it back in the car and see how it starts again, and just maybe check the power supply coming to the Pertronics unit. All right, so I got my oscilloscope set up with the blue line is going to be my positive power. Just move it down so I got plenty of room. And my yellow line is going to be my trigger signal. I've got each one set at 5 volts per division. Currently monitoring at 20 milliseconds is the refresh. And we're going to crank it and see A, if the engine starts, and B, if we get a nice clean trigger signal and a nice clean power signal at the same time. Okay, go ahead and crank it. Yeah, that's ignition bleeding in onto power. So it's really hard to show you diagnosing a problem because A, I'm moving from spot to spot to spot, and B, it's just really hard to get a camera in there and see it. So I'm just going to explain what I did with this car. So looking at all of the issues, car came in, hard start, cold, degrading to a misfire when hot sometimes, And the problem was somewhat intermittent. The first time I tried to start the car after it was dropped off, it did not really want to start and run. And when it actually did at wide open throttle, I couldn't get the engine above 1200 RPM. So fuel pressure gauge is on, fuel pressures are good. The car needs a lot of service. We haven't seen it in 8 years and pretty much has had very little service looking at it in those 8 years. No issues with fuel pressure, so pretty much our left gauge is on, but that's not where the issue is. One of the clues to this problem was when I was cranking the engine, the tach was very erratic in where it would jump. On my oscilloscope, I was getting some weird trigger signal, so I pulled the distributor and checked it on the bench. Couldn't replicate it on my test bench, so I put the distributor back in. And also found another issue with power. This car, the alternator charging light comes on when you turn the key on. When you start the car, the alternator does not begin to charge. And then when it does start charging, it goes into an overcharge situation.
It's climbing, but that's overcharging.
Now that is contributing to the overall issues, but it was not the actual issue. So finally, what I ended up doing was clamping one of my inductive probes onto the coil wire, because with the engine started and running, it was running, but it was hitting on like 5.5 cylinders. Gas analyzer revealed that fuel mixtures were at 2.7%. Maybe a hair high, but not really a problem, but well over 1,000 hydrocarbons. On my scanner, I was seeing my coil signal was all over the place. Sometimes it'd be high, sometimes it'd be low. The pattern was scattered. So what I did is I swapped out for a replacement coil, because what I suspected was going on is maybe an intermittent short inside this coil where it's shorting to ground. As soon as I plugged in another coil, the car all of a sudden started hitting on 6 cylinders. It's responding the way it should do. My hydrocarbons went from 1,200 hydrocarbons down to 100. CO climbed slightly, not to be unexpected, but not a major deal. So the long and the short of it, the first part that the car needs is an ignition coil, which we'll install that here in a minute and rerun everything. But it also needs a lot of other stuff. In my process of going through the ignition system, I did pull all the plugs. They were wet. They showed signs, a lot of signs of fuel on them. Car did not want to start in the morning, and that was due to a reduced spark energy reaching the plugs. I did check all the spark plug connectors. They are all fine. They were all within 1,000 ohms plus or minus 10%. I did also do a leak down test, because without a good solid base on the engine, even though we built this engine 8.5 years ago, doesn't mean that things couldn't have changed, as we haven't seen it in a long time. Leak downs were all 10% on all cylinders, which is great. It's what we want to see. Still shows signs where it could use a cylinder head retention and valve adjust. Doesn't look like the covers have been off anytime soon. So still had to go through that entire diagnostics procedure. So it fired right up this morning. It is surging. That's a different issue. There's still a lot of things that need to be done on this car. I've quoted for doing a major service, which it's well and truly overdue for, which will cover valve adjustment, head retention, and mixture adjustment. Most likely the surge is because it's running on the rich side, but as far as starting up, no hesitation. Engine crank, probably not even a full revolution to fire up this morning, which is what we were looking for. There's still a lot more things to do on this car, but I think now it's ready to go back to the owner. He likes to do some of the work himself. I do have a list of things. I just went around and did all my basic safety stuff, making sure the lights are working, tires are tight, etc. Found left rear tail light lens. The brake light bulb is not working. The issue is not with the bulb, it's with the housing itself. It needs a new housing. We got headlights are stuck on high beam. There is no high-low. Possibly the turn signal switch is the issue there. It's common for those contacts to weld themselves together. We also have some problems up front with suspension that I'll be letting him know about. So that wraps it up for this one though.